So long-term regulation of blood pressure is controlled significantly by the kidney itself. So we've looked at short-term regulation, and one part of short-term regulation involves baroreceptors. They quickly adapt to chronic high blood pressure or low blood pressure, so they're ineffective for long-term regulation. That long-term regulation has to occur because of the kidneys. So these long-term mechanisms, the way they work in the kidneys is they actually alter the blood volume via the kidneys. And they do this in a couple different ways. There's a couple different pathways. There is the direct mechanism, the direct renal mechanism. There's also the indirect renal mechanism, which is also called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. You may want to abbreviate that as RAA to remember it a little more easily. So the direct mechanism, it's significant because it doesn't function with hormones. It's independent of hormones. What occurs is when the blood pressure increases, for example, and remember that blood pressure and blood volume are directly related, so when one goes up, the other goes up. This causes the elimination of more urine to reduce the blood pressure, would be the result. Conversely, if we have decreased blood pressure, which again is the same as decreased blood volume, it causes the kidneys to conserve water, thus increasing blood pressure. So these are negative feedback situations where there's a stimulus and then the response is the opposite of that. So let's look at the indirect mechanism now. And the indirect mechanism is going to include the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So as I said in the last slide, you may want to remember RAA for that for short. And what happens is when the blood pressure drops, it triggers the kidney to release a chemical called renin. And renin enters the blood, and it actually catalyzes the conversion of this large chemical called angiotensinogen, which is in the liver, to make angiotensin I. But what's significant now here is that angiotensin I is converted into angiotensin II. And I know that seems really confusing, but for our purposes, the really important one to remember is angiotensin II. And the hormone or the enzyme that is responsible for this is ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. You may know there's ACE hardwares. There's one on 580 I just drove by today and thought of ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. So the ACE converts angiotensin I to angiotensin II. So angiotensin II now is very, very powerful, and it does 4 things to stabilize the blood pressure and the extracellular fluid. The first thing it does is it stimulates aldosterone secretion. So again, aldosterone is the second word after angiotensin, so that makes sense. It also causes ADH hormone to be released from the posterior pituitary, and it causes our thirst centers to be activated, to drink more water. So this is a way of replenishing fluids to increase blood pressure, because again, more blood volume, more blood pressure. And the fourth thing is that angiotensin II is a powerful vasoconstrictor. So all 4 of these are going to increase blood pressure. So let's look at the combination of the direct and the indirect on this next slide. And we'll zoom into some of the parts just to show you that. First of all, I want to show you the direct one that we talked about. The direct doesn't involve hormones. So we start with a decrease in arterial pressure. What happens is the kidney responds by filtering less, thus forming less urine, and by doing so, there's more fluid that remains in the body to increase blood volume, thus increasing blood pressure. So, because of that, it's a negative feedback system, the direct renal mechanism. Now, the indirect renal mechanism, again, is thought of as the renin angiotensin system, RAA, and I think it helps if we kind of start in this case at, we can look at, we'll just start at the top here like we did before. So the same stimulus applies. There's a decrease in arterial pressure. That inhibits baroreceptors, and that increases sympathetic nervous activity because of the cardioacceleratory center. But that's very short term. The long term now is that renin is going to be released by the kidneys. And the kidney causes this chemical called angiotensinogen to be converted to angiotensin 1. And angiotensin 1 is not active yet. It can't have the effect that angiotensin 2 has. So the really, really important part is angiotensin 1 being converted to angiotensin 2 by ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. So the various factors now that are going to affect the various effects that are going to respond from angiotensin 2 are that it's going to affect the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex releases various hormones, one of which is aldosterone, and aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption by the kidneys. That means that sodium goes back into the bloodstream, which would increase blood pressure. The second mechanism is that it increases ADH release by the posterior pituitary, and eventually this hormone will increase water reabsorption by the kidneys. So it's another mechanism that can increase blood volume. The third is that there is an increase in thirst via the hypothalamus. So the person drinks more water, brings in more fluids, thus increasing the blood volume, the eventual goal. So we have these various factors that all affect blood volume. And then finally, the last one, angiotensin II, is a powerful vasoconstrictor. So it allows the blood vessel to constrict to get smaller in diameter. So remember, the relationship between diameter of blood vessels is that when the diameter decreases, the amount of resistance increases, total peripheral resistance. Specifically, this is really important in the arterioles where this happens. So to summarize blood pressure regulation, we want to just talk briefly about what the goal of blood pressure regulation is, and that's to keep the blood pressure high enough to provide adequate tissue perfusion. And the word perfusion means that tissues are receiving adequate oxygen and nutrient supply. However, that could be too high. It needs to be a specific amount. So for example, in the brain, if the blood pressure is too low, for example, if there's no blood that goes to the brain for 2 to 3 seconds, a person will lose consciousness. So think of a chokehold, for example. But 5 to 6 minutes without receiving oxygen and nutrients, that leads to brain death. So it's very important, especially in the cerebral circulation, to deliver the oxygen and the nutrients. If perfusion is inadequate, that can lead to the loss of consciousness. But on the other hand, if it's too high, the person could have a stroke. Factors that increase the mean arterial pressure. I keep saying mastering, excuse me, because I'm mastering A and P. It's mean arterial pressure. Factors that increase the mean arterial pressure are shown here. So we're going to kind of go down here and look at what we know first. You've learned now that the cardiac output is calculated by the stroke volume and the heart rate by multiplying those together. And you've also learned that the total peripheral resistance is due to the diameter of the blood vessels, the blood viscosity, and the blood vessel length. So the diameter of the blood vessel, again, when the diameter decreases, the resistance increases. As the viscosity increases, this may occur in things like dehydration. So I'm going to zoom back out so we can go up to the top of this diagram here. We have dehydration or high hematocrit. A high hematocrit, remember, is called polycythemia. Blood doping can lead to a high hematocrit as well. There can be a large increase in body size, leads to the increase in blood vessel length. The diameter of the blood vessels are going to be affected by vasomotor tone. And then over here we see that the stroke volume has to do with venous return, blood volume, so you should know how these various factors affect each other. Homeostatic imbalances in blood pressure we think of homeostasis. We think of hypertension as the first thing. With hypertension, the elevation above 140/90 is considered hypertension. Pre-hypertension is kind of before that, and that's when the doctor should be aware of what's going on with the patient. But prolonged hypertension can lead to things like heart failure, vascular disease, renal failure, stroke, and so on. So there's two types of hypertension. There's primary hypertension, and then there is secondary hypertension. The primary hypertension is the one that's due to many of the factors that I know you have heard about: heredity, diet, obesity, age, diabetes, mellitus, stress, smoking. Also, there's things that you can do with your diet, like restrict salt, fat, cholesterol intake, increase exercise, lose weight, stop smoking. And then there's anti-hypertensive drugs. These would be things like beta blockers, or diuretics, or ACE inhibitors. So the secondary hypertension, this is the one that's a little less common, and it's actually due to unidentifiable disorders at this point. So there's a lot of research being done on this. The jury's still kind of out on this. In truth, there's many genes that affect hypertension. And with blood pressure, the kidneys, the blood vessels, and the heart have to play a role. So it could be a multitude of things. The opposite of hypertension is hypotension. Hypotension is low blood pressure, and it's a low blood pressure below 90/60. Now, this number of 90/60, it could be a common number in an elderly patient, for example, especially very small, petite, elderly person would have that specific blood pressure. Types of hypotension include orthostatic hypotension. Orthostatic hypotension means that when you change positions, when you rise suddenly, you get dizzy because of the low blood pressure. Chronic hypotension is a hint of poor nutrition, and it's a good indication to the doctor that there might be other issues, such as Addison's disease or hypothyroidism. And finally, acute hypotension is an important sign of circulatory shock. So circulatory shock is an immediate response of the body by the sympathetic nervous system to increase heart rate and cause vasoconstriction. So the types of circulatory shock are hypovolemic shock, where there's large-scale blood loss, vascular shock, where there's extreme vasodilation, thus decreased peripheral resistance. So again, when there's dilation, when the lumen of the blood vessel is larger, there's less resistance. The smaller the blood vessel, the more resistance there are. And then finally, the last type would be cardiogenic shock, and we see cardio in the word, so we know it has to do with a heart issue, an inefficient heart causing inadequate circulation.